We'll start at like 9:37. So that's in about 4 minutes. Let me just okay, we're live. All right. So yeah, about 2 minutes, and we'll get started. And yeah, if you hear crickets in the background, I mean, it's like 9:30, so I just want to go ahead and get that out of the way. So yeah, we'll begin here very shortly. Good, put my phone on Do Not Disturb because if I end up getting like a phone call or something during this, I would be pretty pissed off, so. But it's on Do Not Disturb, so I'm not going to get any random phone calls, so it's all good. Alright, I'm going to begin now. So this is not a story time I want to make. However, it is a story time I have to make. I have a few reasons for that. One is that this situation is what I consider to be when I went from being a child to being an adult. My coming of age story if used in a literary sense. Another reason is that the chances are there might be someone watching this story time, so by learning from my experience, they might be able to get help from it. One final reason is that this is probably the most important time period of my life. To really understand me as a person, you have to understand the situation. I discussed the situation in Storytimes 10 and 23, but I wanted to dedicate an entire storytime to just this situation as it's too important just to skim over. So let's begin. Depression is a very serious illness that affects millions. It affected me a few years ago. It was an extremely dark time period of my life, and it also resulted in me having the worst days of my life. So today, I want to discuss this time period. I'm Zach, and this is Storytime 28 on July 16th, 2021. So let's start off with the disclaimer. So as you could probably guess, this story time is going to get really dark. Depression is a very dark topic, but I will also be discussing things like self-harm, death threats, bullying, suicide, and more. So if you are prone to these kinds of topics, then I recommend clicking off the stream. Now let's talk about some backstory. So I started with depression from September 2017 to March 2018. I consider January to August 2017 as the pre-depression period. I consider this as a time period of growth and just being a fun time to live in general. I generally have a lot of fun discussing this time period, especially the month of May. I guess that's why 7th grade was such a great school year for me. Anyways, let's jump to August 2017. So this would be when I began the 8th grade. I was 13 years old. Right off the bat, I predicted that this would be a very difficult school year. The reason was because I was taking the hardest classes my school offered. So in the first semester, I was taking World History, a 9th grade history course. In the second semester, I was taking Accelerated 8th grade Science, as well as Earth Environmental Science, which was a 9th grade science course. For the full year, I was taking Algebra 1, a 9th grade math class, and Accelerated 8th grade English. Yeah, those are just some very difficult classes. Another class I want to mention is PE. So my PE teachers just sucked. Basically, if you played any school sport, then they automatically liked you. If you didn't, then they hated you. I should emphasize the term school sport, as I actually swam competitively during this time, just that it was not aligned with school, it was a club sport. So therefore, the PE teachers of course didn't like me. Not only that, but I'm pretty nerdy. At the time, my IQ was higher than my weight. My IQ is 128, and I weighed about 120 pounds in 8th grade. I also wear glasses, I play video games, I wasn't very popular, and the list goes on. So yeah, the PE teachers didn't really like me. One last thing to mention regarding PE is warm-ups. So there were 3 things we could do for warm-up. One is dancing, where we would all dance to 3 Just Dance songs. The first one was generally a solo dance, the second a group of 2, and the third was a group of 4. I had at least had a few friends in PE, unlike a couple classes, so I had these covered. The second was jogging, where we would run around the gym for 2 songs. Then the worst one we could do was insanity. This is where we watched some guy do exercises with a bunch of other people, which of course we did the exercises with them. In Storytime 10, I referred to this warm-up as being from the depths of Tartarus, and I gotta say that's a pretty accurate representation of how brutal insanity was. We generally did about 2 rounds, which even then felt like too much. Overall, PE was just trash, but this is not even the main reason why PE was bad, as we'll see later on. So that's all the backstory I want to mention. Now let's jump to it. I think the best place to start is to describe the lunch situation. So our school had a rule that stated that you could only sit with the people in your second block. Each class had assigned tables. My second block was English. I believe we had 4 tables. 1 table, which included my friend Robbie, was full, and 2 would not allow me to sit with them. The other table did allow me to sit with them. However, they were bullies. They made me feel shitty throughout the entire time period, but no other table would let me sit with them, so I was stuck here. So therefore, I had to endure 35 minutes of constant harassment every day. Sometimes, I even put myself at a silent lunch table so that I wouldn't have to sit with them. They were that bad. What made it suck even more is that I had a ton of friends in another class, but yet I was not allowed to be with them because of the rule. So therefore, I began feeling bad about myself. I felt like nobody really cared about me and I was really just a waste of space. This is the sort of depression. However, lunch was not the only place these bullies were. I had them in not just every core class, but I also was with them in PE, which is probably the worst class to have with them, as they bullied me in PE. They were athletic students, so therefore, they could literally get away with bullying me in front of teachers. Yeah, my PE teachers were dicks. However, these were not the only bullies. I also had to deal with some bullies on the bus. Most of them were 7th graders, and wow, were these kids just downright assholes. We had assigned seats, which is what really made it worse since I was not allowed to move. My seat had 3 of us. There was me and 2 7th graders. One of the 7th graders was cool. We didn't talk. He just did he and I did me. We were cool. But then the other decided to be a dick and make fun of me on the ride back. He did this alongside some others we sat around. So really the bullying went outside of school too. I rode the bus back to my mom's school. Once I got out, the bullies would generally shout insults at me and laugh when I got off. Overall, just really immature brats. I also want to discuss the workload, as this also stirred up depression quite a bit. So Algebra 1 had a lot of homework, generally about 3 to 4 pages of homework a night. Each page had like 10 or 15 problems. Yeah, it was pretty crazy. Combined with the fact that I had swim practice, I never got much sleep, but like this is how we learn how to do the math. If it was not for the homework, I don't think I would have passed the class. By the way, I'm not meaning to hate my algebra teacher, as he's actually one of the best teachers I've ever had. Same goes with my science and English teacher. We'll see later on just how incredible these teachers were, but damn did the homework feel excessive at times. I also want to mention social media, as that also affected my mental health negatively. So there were 2 platforms which very negatively impacted me. One was Google+. So there was a lot of drama on Google+. Seemed like everyone would try to find a way to hate each other. I ended up getting caught up in this, which of course resulted in me getting backlash and getting more hate to be piled on top of the hate at school. The drama really hurt me, as I was fighting with people I didn't even know in person. The other social media platform I want to talk about is YouTube. So I've been doing YouTube for over 5 years now. I started my channel on June 20th, 2016, and uploaded my first video 2 days later. I generally got very positive comments, as well as a lot of meme comments, which I always really liked. However, sometime around December of 2017, I began getting hate. And when I say hate, I mean a death threat from a 24-year-old man. So basically, I was friends with this one girl who had drama with this guy in 2014, and was still in drama with. This man sent death threats to her, as well as her friends, including me. He was also friends with those on Google+, which of course made things even more problematic. Fortunately, karma would come bite him in the ass later on, but that wouldn't be until 2019. So for now, he basically was an absolutely disgusting man who sent death threats to children. So I also want to briefly mention that a couple months ago, I managed to find a Google Plus archive since it was shut down in April of 2019. And I've got to say, it was super difficult to read these. I don't think 13-year-old me realized just how vile and cruel these messages and comments were like 17-year-old me realizes now. And the fact that I endured these every day, wow. Nobody should have to deal with such vile stuff. Same goes with the death threats, just downright obnoxious and childish behavior by those to me, who is just an innocent 13-year-old boy already getting bullied at school and getting picked on with homework. So how did depression affect me regarding my ability to do normal things? Well, for really the rest of 2017, it didn't really mess with my normal life. While yes, I was feeling bad about myself in a hostile environment, I still managed to live quite normally, but it did mess with my behavior some. One would be cussing. Now, I obviously still cuss today. I mean, I've already used a couple non-family friendly words in this story time alone, but I don't actually cuss that much. I only cuss on YouTube, with my friends, and with my parents. That's it. But back then I used to cuss very excessively. Like about every other word I spoke was the F word, and that's not an exaggeration. I most of the time cussed out other people, as that was how I tried to cope with depression, but it was always counter-effective, as it seemed like every time I cussed someone out, I felt even worse about myself. Then that kind of brings me to another effect, letting others influence me. I just started becoming much more meaner in general, as I let the bully's behavior influence my own. I did it in order to try to establish myself as part of the group and try to prove that I was cool like the bullies, when in all reality, I was already far cooler than the bullies could ever be. It was just that the bullies in my second block lacked the wisdom to realize that these bullies were not cool. They're a bunch of pussies who have to be mean to someone in order to make themselves feel good. And I too lacked wisdom as well, as I let these bullies' behavior influence mine, which unfortunately led to depression spinning out of control in 2018. And by the way, I still regret everything I said and did in late 2017 and early 2018. I know that I didn't know better at the time since I was just compressed with depression, but it still haunts me to this day, even as a rising senior, that I was very negative influence to others back in 8th grade. It's kind of a similar case to the nightmares, which I'll discuss near the end of today's story time. So let's jump to 2018. So this was a very strange year. I consider it to be the second best year of my life, only behind 2019, but yet this year also included the worst days of my life as well as the absolute worst day of my life. It's also when depression begins to go out of control. Now, one thing I want to mention is that nobody knew I was depressed. My teachers didn't know, my parents didn't know, my friends didn't know, nobody knew. They actually wouldn't find out until mid-February. So now, I want to kind of update y'all on how school is going. So January would of course be the beginning of the second semester. This meant that now I no longer had world history. Instead, that would be swapped with 8th grade science. Now we get out of 8th grade social studies since we took world history. However, we had to take 8th grade science because it was an EOG class, which is basically our standardized end-of-year test here in North Carolina. So about this class in particular, I really loved this class. It was overall really fun and I learned a lot. However, looking back on it, the one thing I remember most about this class was the teacher. So this teacher was absolutely incredible. She really went above and beyond in order to make sure everyone was alright. In fact, she would actually go on to save my life in March, as we'll see later on. But alongside taking 8th grade science, I also was taking a class called Earth Environmental Science. So this is a high school science course that was completely online. There was actually a lot of requirements to be able to take this course early. One, you had to make a 5 on your 5th grade science EOG, which I did. I actually made the highest grade in the entire school on that one. Then I believe you had to make all A's and B's all year long, which I of course did. And then the final requirement was that you had to make an A in world history. I did that. In fact, I actually made the highest grade in my class in world history. There were also, of course, technology requirements and stuff, which I had. So I was able to take the course, and I decided to. However, I deeply regret taking this course. The reason was because it put me in even more stress than I already was in. Obviously, I was taking algebra as well as dealing with depression, so it really was not a good idea to do it. However, I feared that if I didn't take it, then my parents would get all mad at me and I'd get into fights with them. So in a way, I felt like I was forced to take it. This class, like algebra, took a pretty big toll on my mental health. Recently, I actually talked with my parents about the whole thing. According to them, they actually said that they would not have gotten mad at me had I not taken this course. Well, damn, if only I knew before signing up. I mean, I know this was like over 3 years ago, but still. However, what really drove me absolutely insane in our environmental science were the labs. We had to do these labs ourselves. We had to record data and all that other stuff. But the worst part about it was that we had to take pictures of us doing the lab. This is what made me go absolutely crazy. I actually had to go out of my way and get the materials and stuff. That was extremely painful. Like, I'm 13 years old. You really expect me to be able to set everything up? Yeah, our environmental just sucked. And the worst part about it is that I signed it up myself to do it because of pressure I had with my parents. This was definitely one of the worst decisions I think I've ever made. So let's jump to February. This would be the month where depression just went berserk. So let's talk about the lunch situation again. Of course, I was being bullied and nobody had to sit with. And then I was not allowed to sit with my friends since they were in a different class than me. However, the bullies decided that now they were going to try a different tactic. This tactic was by sitting at other tables. Yeah, those tables that would not allow me to sit with them. I was fine not even talking to them. I just didn't want to be bullied. But yet they allowed these bullies to sit with them, who were the absolute scummiest pieces of shit? Yeah, my whole second block seemed to be like the bullies. They wanted me to feel absolutely terrible about myself. So then as a result, I of course was sitting by myself. Literally everyone in my second block was laughing and enjoying lunch, and then there was me who was by himself at a table because nobody wanted to be with him. Of course no phones were allowed, so therefore I basically sat there by myself just looking at my food. I didn't eat at all, mostly due to embarrassment. This went on for the first 2 weeks of February. So how did the situation end in mid-February? Well, remember the effects of depression I mentioned earlier? Well, my teacher started to notice them, as well as of course noticing me by myself at lunch. So that's when they got in contact with both of my parents and the school counselor. I believe they had this meeting while I was at PE one day. They basically talked about my change of behavior from the beginning of the year to then. Also, it seemed like some students kind of reported my sudden changes in behavior. Not only that, but there was actually an entire class that seemed to be worried about me that I wasn't even in. That would be my science teacher's second block. A lot of my friends were in that class, by the way. Keep that class in mind, as this class is going to be very vital later on. So then, let's discuss that night. So pretty obviously, my parents were quite concerned. They didn't know what I was going through or really any of this, so they were quite shocked. I never told them anything about this beforehand. The reason is because I felt like they always antagonized me whenever I went to them about my problems. Like, it always seemed like they felt I was the one that was in the wrong. However, I will say that they have gotten better at this. In March, we're going to see the worst day of my life. This would be when they really changed and to stop antagonizing me for my problems. So therefore, I'm not trying to hate on my parents, as they did improve and learn, so it's all good. So that night we came up with a plan to try to get me away from the class for lunch. We discussed this plan with the counselor, and she approved. So therefore, the way lunch worked for me now is that I would eat in the room beside the cafeteria. I believe this room was right outside the principal's office. There was a one-way window on it, so I could see everyone in the cafeteria, but they couldn't see me. While this solution did at least get me away from the bullies, it really didn't solve the root of the problem. The root of the problem was that nobody wanted to be with me, and I felt like I was just an inconvenience to everyone's life. So therefore, this really didn't help all that much, but at least I wasn't being bullied at lunch. I also want to mention Robbie again. So as mentioned before, Robbie was basically my only friend in second block. However, he didn't sit at that table I was at for the same reasons mentioned earlier. The bullies were also really mean to him. However, he was lucky and one table let him sit with them. They were full, so I couldn't sit with them. Nonetheless, Robbie was still a good friend. We're still close friends today. However, my counselor made Robbie aware of the situation. He was the only person who knew where I was at lunch, so therefore, he was in charge of basically telling me it was time to leave so I wouldn't stay there for too long. This would go on for about 3 weeks until a very dark situation occurred in early March that I will discuss in a bit. So now, as mentioned before, mid-February would be when depression went absolutely berserk. What I mean is that this would be the month where I went from being depressed to becoming suicidal. I started to think that maybe the world would be better off without me. I believe that if I had just killed myself, then the world would be a better place. I would have these thoughts for the next 3 weeks. So then that brings us to March. more specifically March 8th. Now, before I get to this day, I first want to mention that this is the darkest and most depressing part of the entire story time. Suicide is a very big topic when discussing this day, so if you don't feel comfortable with these kind of topics, then please click off the stream. So, March 8th, 2018, when asked about the worst days of my life, there is one day that always comes to my mind, and that is this day. Although it was almost 3.5 years ago, I still remember every detail from it. So this would be the day where I went from being suicidal to actually coming up with a plan to commit suicide and starting the attempt. I will not discuss the plan as it's very difficult for me to talk about. However, I will mention that it began that morning and that would ultimately end it all that night. I also was very stressed out with schoolwork this day. I of course had the usual math and earth environmental science homework, but I also had some 8th grade science work, a test for English to study, and a project for English to do, so that's another reason I chose March 8th out of all day. So then let's discuss it. So I woke up to some drama on Google+. I also received a death threat from that YouTuber, so that kind of set the mood. So that morning, before going to my mom's school, I harmed myself. I harmed myself on the bus on the way to her school, on the bus from her school to my school, as well as in science class. So that brings us to science. So the reason I consider my 3 teachers in 8th grade to be the greatest teachers I've ever had. So in science, I was just completely unmotivated to do anything, which is pretty obvious why. Now, we often played a game called quizzes in science, which is kind of like a knockoff Kahoot. I was normally in the top when it came to quizzes and Kahoot. However, I didn't even answer a question, so that's when my science teacher noticed something was up. She then apprehended me and asked me what was going on. I mentioned what was going on. She also noticed the places on me where I had harmed myself, so afterwards, she got me set up with the counselor. So then the counselor came. She took me to her office. I was ordered to get my stuff. We then called my mom. Mom got her students with another class and came rushing to my school. Me and my counselor then went to the front office to wait on my mom. However, someone unexpectedly came too. That someone was my youth pastor. So my youth pastor is someone I look up to very highly and has been my role model since I started going to his church in the summer of 2017. One thing he does is that he visits everyone at youth during lunch. So very conveniently, he was actually by the front office when we arrived when Mom arrived. Mom was there too, and she explained what was happening. Afterwards, we 4 went into a room privately to talk. So I remember sitting in this room, I remember talking about it to my youth pastor, and then just right there, I just started crying. Now, I'm a very emotionless person. That's how I was able to hide my depression for so long. So for me to cry means that yes, this is a very serious situation. And it was. I had a plan to take my own life, and had already begun the attempt. I was, of course, extremely sad. I believe Mom started tearing up too. Then my counselor discussed what we should do. She recommended that I go to the mental hospital. This was a good idea, so afterwards, she gave me a hug and wished me well. We left school at around 11 o'clock. I believe later on that day, my counselor and teachers let Robbie know what was going on. This would prove to have a very negative effect on him. My youth pastor walked me and Mom to the van. He then talked a little bit and prayed with us. Afterwards, me and Mom headed home. When we got back home, both me and Mom took a nap. Afterwards, she called Dad to let him know what was going on. He had work, so he couldn't be there, but he would meet us at the hospital later that night. So at around 4:30, me and Mom headed to the hospital. I remember on the drive up there, Mom said, "I don't know why this situation is happening, but all I know is that God is using it for His glory." She was right. This situation would be used for His glory, which I'll discuss later. And then we arrived at the hospital at around 5 o'clock. Dad got to the hospital at around 5:15. While at the hospital, I had to get blood drawn as well as do drug tests and other stuff. The attempt did not involve ingesting anything, by the way. It was a violent one that I of course have a difficult time talking about. They also gave me a pair of socks. While I was allowed to wear my normal clothes, I had to wear a pair of socks so that I didn't fall. I actually still have those socks today. I used them to help remember my stay and to make the story time. Then around 7:30, I was left in a room. My parents then said goodbye and headed back home. In this room, there's a TV as well as some food for me. I didn't eat any of the food. In fact, I didn't eat anything at all that day. I remember being in that room for a few hours. I believe it wasn't until 10 o'clock when I was taken to the mental health ward. It was the top floor of the hospital, being floor 7. About 3/4 of the floor was dedicated to adults, while the other quarter was for children. I was in the children's section my entire stay, of course. So now, I've never talked much about my stay at the mental hospital. I briefly touched on it in Storytime 10, but I didn't talk about it much. In this Storytime, I'm going to go into more depth about it. Anyways, my first full day at the mental hospital was March 9th. So the way this ward was structured was that there were two hallways. One hallway was the girls' hallway, and the other was the boys' hallway. I believe it was just me and 6 girls for the first day, so I had the entire hallway to myself. The hallway would meet at the group room. Groups were basically where we did normal life at the hospital. It's where we basically got advice and that stuff. This is also where we ate. So then there was breakfast about 7 o'clock. This would be my first meal since March 7th. It was just simply eggs and bacon. Nothing too spectacular. Then afterwards, we did groups. I remember in this group we were discussing basically why suicide is not the answer. I remember near the end of the lecture, my doctor called me. So during this time, the doctor talked to us all one by one. So then I went to her office. We pretty much just talked about how I was feeling and my thoughts and other stuff. You know the drill. Afterwards, I went back to groups. So I believe after the lecture, it was snack time. So the group room had a refrigerator. It included things like apple juice as well as ice cream and other sweet stuff. We'd eat and then talk. So let's talk a little bit about the people I was with. I won't talk about the girls individually, as it would be extremely disrespectful of me to do so in this manner. So instead, I'll discuss the group. So it seemed like the girls were in a similar boat as me. They were all suicidal as well. I believe I was the youngest of them. Throughout my stay, we would all become great friends. I'm not sure where any of them are today, but I do hope they are all doing well. So then came recreation, or rec as I'll call it. So this was done by some Russian guy. We basically walked around and did stretches. Basically a very relaxed version of PE from 6th grade, so it wasn't bad. Then came lunch. So what was on the menu? Chicken tenders and fries. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, that's where you're wrong. Because wow, was this some of the worst meals I ever ate. This was for both lunch and dinner. I commonly refer to this food as dog shit, and that's what I'll refer to it as for the duration of the story time, since that's what I told my parents what it tasted like while at the hospital. Because of how bad it was, I would actually go on to lose my appetite the next day, which resulted in me having to stay a day longer than I normally would have. After lunch, it was music time. So this was in the recreational room. This is where as well as the girls, spent most of our time. So in music, we basically had this one guy bring his laptop and we got to play any song we liked, just as long as it was clean. I believe I chose a Fall Out Boy song each time it was my turn, but I can't remember exactly what songs I chose. Afterwards, we basically had free time until 5 o'clock. Me and the girls played Uno while watching some movies. Then it was 5 o'clock, time for dinner. Dinner was the same as lunch, same dog shit. Then at 6 o'clock, it was time for visitation. So the only visitors allowed were parents. So therefore, only my parents came to visit me. I remember while we were talking that night, one of the nurses came over and talked to the parents. I remember when she came over to us, she said that I was way too smart to be there. I'm a very smart person. I'm not afraid to admit it like many others my age. And looking back on it, she was right. As someone as smart as me, I should have not let others influence my thoughts, which is how I ended up in the hospital. I also remember from this meeting where my parents talked about looking through my phone. They found the death threats from that one YouTuber. They also saw a bunch of the trash sent to me on Google+. I remember Mom saying that if she saw that man who sent me death threats, she would smack the living shit out of him. And hallelujah, because I would too. Although I'd probably go farther. Anyways, this was actually the moment they found out I was getting into all that drama. Before, they thought I was only suicidal because of the bullies. But now they knew the full picture. After the visitation was over, we played a little bit more in the rec room, and then we went back to our rooms. My parents also brought some stuff for me. I believe they brought me some clothes as well as a Bible. I also went to discuss sleep. So every night at the mental hospital, I had a nightmare about either the lunch situation or the events of March 8th. Unfortunately, as we'll see later on, these nightmares are not just exclusive to the hospital, as they actually still plague me today. Before I move on to the next day, I first want to talk about how everyone was doing back home. So my parents and sister were of course freaking out. They were scared and didn't know what would happen. I believe none of them got any sleep. At school, my science teacher's second block was very concerned. Some of the people actually asked where I was at. My science teacher just said that I was doing fine and everything was going to be okay. Yeah, a class I wasn't even a part of was concerned. That is some respect right there. My teachers were also of course concerned. All 3 of them kept in touch with my parents and tried to help comfort them. They also notified my parents of what was happening at school and anything I missed. Of course then my parents would deliver this information to me at visitation every night. And then whatever, I'd say they'd also report to the teachers what was going on. But most importantly, I want to mention Robbie. So Robbie was not doing very well. I mean, his friend was on the verge of ending it all. He, of course, was doing horribly. Therefore, his emotions caught up to him. I believe one of the bullies or someone else was harassing him. So then he grabbed the chair and threw it at them. They caught the chair, so nobody got hurt. He got suspended for a day, although I don't think his suspension was actually for punishment. I think it was more for him to rest. My teachers knew we were great friends, and they knew how difficult it was on Robbie, so I think he really needed some time off. So now let's talk about the next day, being Saturday, March 10th. This would be when we got a boy. However, he interestingly was roomed in the girls' hallway for whatever reason. So therefore, I was just by myself in the hallway. So Saturday was basically the same as Friday. However, I remember while eating my snack, it started to hail. We all watched through the window as the hail fell down. I just thought that was pretty cool. So now I want to talk about meeting with my doctor. So she decided that to help with my depression, she was going to prescribe me Zoloft. Zoloft is a drug that slows down your nervous system. So therefore, I started taking Zoloft. I would take this medication at 9 o'clock every night for about 2.5 years. It wouldn't be until I was 16 years old when I laid off the medication. I'll discuss that later on. So then that brings us to Sunday, which was a very difficult day. So getting on any medicine is pretty difficult. It had to situate in your body. Zoloft was not yet situated, so therefore I ended up vomiting that day during breakfast. I then spent all afternoon in bed. Then that night, I was a lot better. I was able to play Uno with everyone and basically do normal stuff. Then comes Monday. So this was a very eventful day. So I remember that morning we got to give our parents a phone call during snacks. I called Mom. She seemed like she was in a good mood and doing well. Then the rest of the day really was normal. However, that night was when things was going to change for the good. So Mom and Dad were a little bit late getting to visitation, so we mostly just cracked jokes and just talked normally. This was definitely one of the best talks we've ever had because I was having a normal conversation and I was being included. I felt loved, something I had never felt in a long time. Well, I had felt love, but it was something I haven't felt in a long time. That's what I meant. We never even discussed depression. That is what I consider to be the moment depression ended. Finally, happy at last, and holy shit was I in to be happy. The next day was of course Tuesday, March 13th, 2018. This was the first day of the post-depression period part 1. So while the depression period was at a time of long-term sadness, this is a time period of long-term happiness. It would last all the way until November 2018. And then there would be part 2, which would be from March 2019 to March 2020. So you bet that now I was super happy. That day in particular, I remember as being one of the best days of my life, which I of course mentioned in Storytime 24. So how about we talk about it? So I woke up super happy, as expected. I was in such a great mood from the night before that it carried on for not just that day, but all the way until November, so you bet I was really happy. My doctor noticed this, so therefore she decided to discharge me. She called Mom and asked her when the best time would be to pick me up. Mom said that she would go now to pick me up. So just like March 8th, she had her students go to another class, but unlike March 8th, it was for something good. Mom arrived about 30 minutes later, very conveniently before lunch too. No more dog shit. So then we got all my stuff and we headed out. So now Mom knew about the dog shit. That's actually what I called it whenever we were talking about the food that Friday. And of course, I had not had anything healthy in like a week. So what did we do? We went to Cracker Barrel. So at Cracker Barrel, I had a vegetable plate. I had steamed broccoli, pinto beans, lima beans, and mac and cheese. And wow, this was super delicious. I consider this to be the best meal of my life. After a week of eating dog shit, I was ready to eat something else. And wow, it tasted better than I think it ever would have had I not endured the food at the hospital. Afterwards, we went to the intermediate school to pick up my sister. Of course, as said earlier, she was scared to death, so we picked her up early. She didn't know I was getting out early, so when she saw me by the front office, she just came running. We hugged for about 30 seconds, and believe me, it felt really nice being reunited with her after being away for a week. Then we got home. I went straight to my room. On my bed, I saw a few letters and cards. One of those letters was from my sister saying that she loves me and is ready for me to get back home. I still have that letter in my room today. I also saw a letter from my grandmother as well as some chocolate chip cookies. By the way, my grandmother makes the best chocolate chip cookies. You cannot tell me otherwise. Also had some letters from some other family members too. Once again, it felt amazing knowing that yes, people do care about me. Afterwards, we played some games together. Then at 5:45, Dad got home. He was super excited to see me. I remember eating a family dinner that night. Afterwards, me and Mom both went to my room and watched The Big Bang Theory. I remember falling asleep at like 9 o'clock, which was very early for me, but I was just so happy that I fell asleep. I also did not have a nightmare that night, so I slept super well until the next morning when I would wake up for school. So there were a few things that were going to change as a result of this whole situation. One of those was my classes. So while I was gone, my parents, teachers, counselor, and principal had a meeting regarding the whole situation. They decided that to prevent this from happening again, they were going to switch my classes around. So normally, I had science first block, then English for second block, and then algebra for third block. However, as a result of the change, I now had English first block, science second block, and algebra third block. They couldn't change any other classes, of course, but that's okay. The only classes I was with bullies in were algebra and PE. However, my algebra teacher made sure that these bullies were as far away as they could be from me. And then in late March, I would get injured, which would result in me not having PE for the rest of the school year. A second change that occurred was family dinners. So before the situation, we never really ate together as a family. Most of the time, it was just heat leftovers and go on. But now we eat as a family almost every night. I think these are a great way for us to come together and are just overall very effective. A third change would be therapy. So since this situation began, I would have mental therapy appointments about every other week. I still do these therapy sessions today, but not as frequently. From the first session on March 22nd, 2018, to around the end of freshman year, I had these bi-weekly. From the end of freshman year to March of 2020, they were monthly. Then the coronavirus pandemic hit, which really messed things up. So from March 2020 to now, they've been about 4 a year. Overall, these sessions are very effective, as I have someone to talk to, as I don't really talk about my problems to my parents that much. However, I'm now going to be having these mental therapy sessions monthly. The reason is simply because I'm starting college this January, so of course I'm going to be very stressed out and all, and I think these monthly sessions would be good for me, and I'm going to need them. A fourth change would be in regards to the internet. So my parents of course took my phone while I was in the hospital. I'm glad they did. It definitely was something that I needed to avoid for that time. This meant that I would take a break from YouTube for about 4 months. I would of course take a break indefinitely from Google+, but I only had a month's break from my phone, as I'd get it back in April, but I still didn't come back to YouTube until July. One final change would be transportation to and from school. So my parents also found out that I was bullied on the bus. I told them. As a result, Mom would start picking me up from school every day until the end of the year. She would not take me to school, since the bus that took me from her school to the middle school had completely different people, and they were all really nice too. So as a result, I no longer had to deal with the people trying to bully me while I was on the bus, and as I got off the bus. So then that of course brings us to the first day back at school. So I was pretty well rested, as I got really good sleep that night before, so I was pretty excited. It seemed like all my new classmates were really happy to have me. I of course now had English as my first block now. Seems like the class was overall very supportive, so I knew that I was definitely with the right people now. I also want to mention another friend, this being Ryan. Like Robbie, he also helps run my Discord server and participates on a lot of Pokemon Showdown streams. Me and Ryan met in 7th grade, and are still friends to this day, just like Robbie. I sat with Ryan in all of my classes as well as with his friends, except PE, but that really won't matter later on. Then comes my new second block, being science. So from here to the end of the school year, my science teacher made sure I was alright every day and made sure if I was ready to learn, as we do not want another March 8th to happen again. Before second block, I remember her pulling me out to the hallway to talk about the new class. She stated that this class was extremely crazy. However, I would have come to find out that yes, this class is crazy, but it was also the good crazy. You know, the crazy that involves people doing the dumbest shit just for you. That's the kind of what happened. Remember, this is the same class that was super concerned about me while I was at the hospital. So as a result, I was quite popular in this class. Only downside is that I was no longer the quizzes king, as this class had a lot smarter people than first block science. But that's nothing compared to the positives. So then I want to discuss PE for a little bit. So I almost had to play basketball with everyone else. Now, I love basketball. I especially love watching basketball. I also enjoy playing it with maybe my family and friends. But with others? Oh hell no! The reason is simply because I suck at it. However, my counselor came in right before I had to play and saved the day. She basically got me set up with all my teachers on what I need to get called up on. My teachers didn't actually give me a due date for these makeup assignments. They basically just told me to get them finished. So therefore, I was able to take my time on them, and that's what I did. I would not go back to PE until Wednesday, March 28th, but that would be the last day I even went to PE. As I said before, I would get injured. Then came lunch. So the lunch situation now took a full 180. Before, I was by myself at my own table because nobody wanted to sit with me. Now, people were actually inviting me to sit with them. Even the popular kids invited me. I ultimately just sat with Ryan and his friends since I was, after all, very loyal to them, but I would still talk to the other tables too, so I talked to everyone. And that's really all that happened the first day back. It's a little bit ironic because I remember one thing that the nurses told us was that at the hospital was that they were not going to fix our problems. Our problems would not just go away after getting discharged. They'll still exist, but we will be able to pick up and tackle the problems and solve them. Ironically for me, my problems actually went away after being discharged. Wasn't being bullied anymore, wasn't being sent death threats, I felt loved, and overall my problems basically went away. I also want to mention schoolwork too. As stated earlier, stress from school was also a factor in depression. But now that I wasn't depressed, I was able to focus more on my schoolwork and was much more motivated. While the difficulty of the classes stayed the same, my attitude towards them as well as my dedication changed. As a result, the math and algebra in particular started to make sense. This would be where my love for math began, and then in high school, I would go on to develop this love for math even farther. Because now everything was making sense, my grade in algebra soared to an A from a low B. Pretty crazy how that happened. So now let's discuss the end of PE. So the only PE class I attended after March 8th was on March 28th. I was now completely caught up with everything, and could basically go back to normal, unfortunately. But it was only for a day. I think I only played once on that day, so it was all good. Now that night though is where I would get injured. What was the injury? Well, I broke both of my arms. Before you ask, no, this was not a suicide attempt. It was just me being a dumbass. What happened was that I tried to jump a tennis net. My shoes got caught in the net. As a result, my body was flown downwards. To protect my head from hitting the concrete, I stretched both my elbows. This resulted in me completely destroying my left arm while receiving only minor fractions on my right arm. I'm right-handed, so I got pretty lucky there. I would end up having surgery on my left arm on April 4th, as well as do physical therapy in May. The scar from the surgery is of course still on my arm today, and it will probably be there for probably the rest of my life. I broke both of my arms 2 days before spring break, so therefore I only missed 1 day of school as compared to missing 3 days from being suicidal earlier in the month. As expected, my classmates were very concerned about where I was at. Mom emailed my teachers letting them know what happened the night before, so they all knew about it. So when my second block asked where I was at, my science teacher told them, which I'm glad she did, as it would have been a lot of explaining to do when I got back. So then about 2 days before I had the surgery, my doctor told me that I didn't need a splint on my right arm anymore, so that arm was free. But then he said that I needed surgery on my left arm, which of course I got that done, since my left arm just completely shattered. So therefore, when I went to school the next day, I was wearing a splint. This is what caused me to get out of PE for the rest of the school year. And when I say next day, I mean April 9th, by the way. Finally, I want to mention one last thing. Remember when my mom said, I don't know why this situation is happening, but all I know is that God is using it for His glory? Well, this would be where her words became truth. So I often consider this whole depression to be my testimony. Basically, a testimony is one story of how they came to know God and how they accepted Him as their Lord and Savior. I will not do a story time on my testimony, simply because this story time is my testimony. So this took place back on DNOW 2018. So DNOW is a church event my church, as well as many churches across the nation do. It's generally sometime in mid-April. I already did story times of both DNOW 2018 and 2021 in case you guys would like to check those out. They are story times 12 and 18 respectively. Anyways, I more particularly want to mention Saturday, April 14th. During DNOW, there are like 3 different big sessions. I refer to these as big-ass sessions in my DNOW story times. So this was the final big-ass session of DNOW 2018. I'm not sure what the guest speaker said, but I felt it calling, and I answered it. This would be the moment that I gave my life to Christ. By far the best moment of my entire life. I was just in awe. Pretty crazy how I went from the worst day of my life to the best day in just 1 month. Now, normally when you give your life to Christ, you're supposed to tell basically everyone around you that you made a decision. That was not the case with me. I only told my parents, youth pastor, and DNOW leader. Everyone would eventually find out later on. What I mean later on, I mean May 13th, 2018. This would be the day that I publicly confessed my faith through baptism. Overall, it was just such a magical and awe-inspiring experience. It's funny because the nurses at the mental hospital repeatedly said that our problems were not going to go away. We were only learning how to deal with them. Pretty hilariously, my problems did go away at the hospital, and then I made the greatest decision I ever made just 1 month after discharge. It's still kind of funny, which, I mean, they were right, but like, just in my case, was kind of rare. So, That's all I'm going to mention for the aftermath of depression. I made a story time on both post-depression periods, so you can check those out if you'd like to know more about how I lived after depression. But I do want to mention that the more distant aftermath. So remember that 24-year-old man who sent death threats to me? Well, karma kind of got him in the ass sometime summer of 2019. He started to turn on his friends. As a result, his friends were understandably pissed off at him. As a result, they joined alliances with that girl and that this man sent death threats to. They managed to get his channel taken down. He was monetized on it, as I believe he had somewhere around 5,000 subs. So therefore, he lost his source of income. According to that girl, who I still talk to this day, this man is now a drunkard who has basically no chance of success. He deserves it, honestly. Being a grown-ass man harassing and sending death threats to children is just downright childish and inhumane, so I'm glad karma came and bit him. Now let's discuss laying off the Zoloft. So I took Zoloft for about 2.5 years. The last time I took Zoloft was in September of 2020, about a month into junior year. I was now 16, and while coronavirus made life suck, it was at least way better than being depressed. So that's when I made the move to stop taking it. 10 months later, and I still think that this was a good decision. I would also go on to struggle with depression again later on. I would struggle with a more minor depression from November 2020 to April 2021. What happened was that a close friend of mine at church died. He was the only person at church who included me and stuff, so I was devastated over his death. But unlike the first depression, I would practice healthier and better habits. One of those was of course the conception of Storytime. Another was using him as an inspiration to get better at Geometry Dash, as my friend was very skilled at Geometry Dash when he was alive. And there were also a few others, too. Of course, I'm no longer depressed over his death, but while I still miss him, I generally think of all the good memories I had with him and try to move forward. And I'm still very thankful for him for just including me and stuff. He was an awesome friend. I really miss him. And then the last thing for the distant aftermath would be nightmares. So, as mentioned earlier, I had a nightmare every night I was in the hospital. These nightmares were very disturbing dreams about either the events of March 8th or my stay at the mental hospital, as well as the lunch situation before my classes were switched. But these were not exclusive to the hospital. They were extremely common during both post-depression periods, but they started getting less common during the middle of post-depression period part 2, which is around August 2019. But as a result, they got more disturbing. I still have these nightmares today. The last one I had was just last Saturday. I can't even describe in detail just how disturbing it was, but they are getting less common, so more than likely they'll become so rare that I won't even get them anymore. So now, I want to do something that I don't normally do in Storytime, that being giving advice. I don't give advice in Storytime because while there is a theme to every Storytime, I don't really want to advise you. I just want to entertain you and make you laugh. But this Storytime is different. I discuss the worst time period of my life, so therefore, I will give some advice. So my first piece of advice, never build these thoughts up in your head. Talk to someone about it. Don't follow in my footsteps. I didn't tell anyone about it. Had my science teacher not listened to my signs, then she would have never had been able to get me the help I needed. I got lucky, damn it! There could have been a chance that she had never paid attention to my signs. If she hadn't, I probably wouldn't even be here to do this story time. I would have been 6 feet underground, and my soul would have been in hell. So don't be like me. Talk to someone close to you. You can even talk to me on Discord or Instagram. I'd be happy to help you. Just don't keep it bubbled up inside. Another piece of advice is don't even consider suicide. One exercise I was challenged to do at the hospital was to write down 5 reasons to live. Therefore, if you feel suicidal or have feelings of self-harm, I challenge you to write 5 reasons to live. If you are able to write at least 1 reason, then you should not consider suicide. If you have nothing to write down, then you're not trying. I'm going to be doing this exercise again in a future story time too, to maybe give you some ideas. But it would not just be 5, I'm going to be doing 100 because there is so much to live for. Another thing too is to consider the fact that if you make or plan or attempt suicide but you survive, you're going to have to live with that. I have to live with what happened on March 8th for the rest of my life. I have nightmares about the whole situation 3.5 years later. Don't do something you're not gonna just don't do something that you're gonna regret later on in life. Just don't. My final piece of advice is to consider the future. I promise you, if you get out of depression, you are literally gonna have the best days of your life. That's what happened to me. After depression ended, I lived the 2 best years of my life, and even now, I still enjoy life a lot. Not only that, but consider a future where you actually went out and committed suicide. How would others react? I know if I actually went in and killed myself, I don't think my parents and sister would be able to live life normally. They would have probably developed some unhealthy habits and might have gone as far as committing suicide themselves. Then my teachers would have also had to live with the fact that their student committed suicide and they didn't do anything about it. Just consider other people into the equation. That's all the advice I have. I hope you take this advice as well as the entire Storytime to heart. Hopefully, the Storytime might have helped you if you were going through what I went through. So that's all I got for today's Storytime. Next week, on July 23rd, 2021, I'll be redoing my Storytime on Fuge 2018. Anyways, that's all I got, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye! Okay, that was a really difficult Storytime to do. Yeah, that was a really challenging story time for me. Pretty obvious why. I mean, I'm talking about depression, so. But I mean, I still think that I did pretty good in that story time. It was hard, but I still think I did good. My throat was a little bit dry too, so I kind of stuttered a bit. But overall, I think I did good reading the script. And I mean, sure, the March 8th segment was really hard to do. Like my tone just went completely low over that, which that always happens whenever I discuss March 8th. Like my tone always drops because March 8th in itself is a really hard thing for me to talk about. I mean, and of course the plan, I don't even talk about the plan just because it is way too difficult for me to talk about. So, but I mean, if you're struggling with like the same stuff that I struggle with, then like I hope you like take the story time and take it to heart. So yeah, that was kind of the goal of this story time. So